it becomes clear and obvious that the ego mind, the person that you took yourself to be, is a fictional character. And the more you recognize its unreality and its nature as a software program in which its desires, its urges, its fears, its confusions are built into it, inherent to it, and that this program is designed to suffer and to create suffering for others. You will also begin to notice that the suffering within the ego is increasing day by day. A point will come, whether you have reached it today or not, that it will be of the highest priority to get out of this fictional character, to be free of the suffering and the confusion, the dread, the anguish. Throughout our world today, people are suffering as never before, in the West as well as the East. And there's a massive epidemic of suicide because people cannot handle the anguish, the pain, the emotional suffering that they cannot either endure consciously or escape through drugs or through any other means. Little do they know that suicide doesn't end the suffering, but actually makes it worse, because the ego doesn't die, it enters into a bardo state from which no one can awaken one from the nightmare of the ego. And that moment that one realizes that the fate of the ego leads everyone to a point where they feel like they have to die to get out of it. Can only be prevented if one realizes that the ego can die while you remain alive, because the ego is not real and is not alive. It is only an artificial program. But when the anguish reaches too high a level, it's very difficult to get out of the ego. It's very difficult to sit and meditate if one is in too much emotional pain. We see that even here in this group, that there are times when people get up because they can't tolerate their pain and have to try to get away from themselves. And they create symptoms of suffering in the body in order to get it out of the mind, or symptoms of suffering in karma in order to get it even further away, but it always boomerangs back. Because it is always a message that one must realize the truth of who one is. And so there are ways of deconstructing the imaginary character of the ego, using logic, using psychological understanding, using dialectical reasoning. But none of that will ultimately take one further than a theoretical understanding of the ego's unreality. There must be a transcendence of thought. There must be an ability to silence the mind completely. The problem is that the ego identifies with thought. The ego simply is a stream of thinking. And so the ego cannot eliminate that stream without eliminating itself. And because it has a terror of the void, even though it hates the suffering that its own thoughts create, it fears even more the end of that. And it fears having to face what is repressed under the stream of conscious thinking within the shadow. It fears recognizing how much harm it has done to itself and others, and how much time it has wasted, and how much love it has failed to give. And how many opportunities for growth it has passed up. And so the ego's reservoir of shame at some point becomes too great to face, and one prefers simply to die than to face it. And yet, that's when one has to face it without any cushions. But one cannot process it after death. It has to be done while the body is alive. And when one succeeds in tracing back the truth of who one is and extracting the true self from the ego mind, one discovers that the self has nothing to do with the ego's story, nothing to do with its beliefs, nothing to do with its traumatic experiences, because the ego was never born. The ego has never been created. It is simply the silent witness of the experience that goes on within the matrix of the mind. And the real self has never suffered and never will. And the real self is not a bodily being, nor does it have a form of any kind. But the concrete thinking of the ego can't grasp that. It's too ineffable. And so the mind wants to hold on to a self-image of a body and of a finite nature that can be controlled and seemingly kept in a situation where one can defend it. But there is nothing to defend. The self cannot be harmed. And the self does not die, nor was it ever born. And the moment one recognizes the truth of this, one will not return to the illusion of the ego. And once one recognizes that we are in a dream, or a motion picture, if you wish, a holographic, technologically advanced simulation, as many scientists are now actually coming to believe and theorize. Just as in a dream or a movie where you see millions of people die, you don't cry over it because you know it's just a fictional story. When you see that this dream of a world is not real and that no one actually dies or suffers, only the illusory character, and that at the moment of death, at least they are free from that character's physical suffering. One understands that this world is a school. It is here to teach us something about the nature of reality that could not be taught without entering into a laboratory such as this, in which we experiment with different forms of consequence, of consciousness, and discover the consequences on a large scale of the interaction of those different kinds of consciousnesses. And what we have discovered is that the ego consciousness cannot survive in a world with peace, with love, with harmony. At the soul level it's possible, but the soul is not stable. As we have seen, there is an entropic process that brings about a fall from soul into ego. Because even soul is a fictional vehicle of a wider scope that carries the consciousness from one fictional character to another in an episodic narrative of epic proportions, so that the soul can enjoy every possible way of living and environment and situation and lifestyle. But all of us have had many lives and many deaths, and we're still here.